The road out of Changte was choked with refugees, and somewhere behind the line of carts a mob was forming that wanted a foreigner's head. It was the summer of 1900, and the whole of northern China had gone up like dry grass. The Empress Dowager had set her seal to it. Kill the foreign devils, burn their chapels, drown their books. From village to village the rumor ran ahead of the killing like a grass fire ahead of the wind. And on a dusty road in Honan, a tall man in a sun helmet was trying to move his wife and 5 small children through it before the fire caught them. He had given the last of his money to the cart drivers. He had walked beside the wheels for days, his throat raw, his eyes burning, sleeping an hour at a time with his back against a wall. And now, in the courtyard of a roadside inn, the crowd that had gathered to gawk had turned into something else. Someone had thrown the first stone. Then a man came at him out of the press with a sword. The first blow caught him across the back of the neck and drove him to his knees. The second laid his scalp open. He felt no pain at first, only a strange warm wetness and a roaring in his ears, and the thought, oddly calm, that he should put himself between the swords and the cart, where his wife sat clutching the baby. So he did. He staggered up and turned his bleeding head toward the blades, and a third stroke split his skull to the bone, and a fourth, and a fifth, and still he would not fall in the direction of his children. By every law of the body, he should have died in that courtyard. He did not. And the man who walked out of Honan with a head full of scars he would carry for the rest of his life had once been a barefoot farm boy in the bush of southwestern Ontario. A boy his neighbors thought would never amount to much. A boy who could not spell, who was laughed at by the educated men of his own church, who failed and was mocked and was passed over again and again. His name was Jonathan Goforth. And this is his story. He was born in the dead of winter, in February of 1859, in a log house near Thorndale, in West Nisurvey Township, north of London, Upper Canada. He was the 7th of 11 children, and the family farmed the kind of land that gives nothing it is not fought for. Stones in the spring, drought in the summer, the cattle to be fetched before dawn and the wood to be split after dark. His father was a hard, honest man who could not read well. His mother sang hymns over the washtub. There was nothing in that house to mark the boy out for anything. No money, no library, no name. What there was work. By the time Jonathan was 15, his father trusted him to run one of the family farms alone, riding out across the concession roads with the year's seed money in his pocket and no one to tell him what to do. He learned to ride, to bargain, to keep accounts in his head. He grew tall and lean and stubborn. And like a great many farm boys in that country and that century, he went to church because that was simply what you did on Sunday. And he felt about it almost nothing at all. Then one ordinary evening, a traveling minister came through the township and preached in the little schoolhouse, and Jonathan, 18 years old, went to hear him the way you might go to hear anything that broke the long sameness of a country winter. He did not expect to be touched. But something in the man's words got under his guard, and on the road home in the dark, he could not shake it. He bought himself a Bible. He read it the way he did everything, head down, all in, and within weeks the boy who had felt nothing had decided, with the whole force of that stubborn nature, to give his life to God. What did that mean exactly? At first he had no idea. He only knew he wanted to be useful, so he started where he was. He gathered the children of the neighboring farms and taught them. He stood up in prayer meetings, read to the ears, and stammered out his testimony. The polished people smiled at the country boy in his homemade clothes. He kept going, and then he read a book that ruined his peace forever. It was the life of a missionary, a man who had gone to the other side of the world and spent himself for people who had never heard the name of Christ. Jonathan closed that book a different person than he had opened it. The thought had got into him the way a seed gets into plowed ground and it would not stop growing. What if he was supposed to go? Him, a farmer who could barely spell, to China. It was a ridiculous idea, and he knew it, and he could not get rid of it. So he did the only thing he could think to do. In 1883, he packed a trunk and went up to Toronto and presented himself at Knox College to train for the ministry, and the educated city men took one look at this overgrown country boy with the wrong clothes and the wrong accent and the wrong manners, and they let him know exactly what they thought. It is hard now to picture how alone he was. The other students were the sons of ministers and merchants. They had Latin and Greek and clean collars. Jonathan had calloused hands and a vocabulary full of barnyard. On the streetcar one day, two of his own classmates sat down beside him, not recognizing him, and began to mock the great gawk of a farmer who thought he could be a minister, laughing at his clothes, his country talk, his presumption. He sat there and heard every word. Why did he stay? Why did he not pack the trunk and go home to a life that made sense? A farm that would have him, a township that knew his name? Because the seed was still growing, because something in him had decided, and Jonathan Goforth, once decided, did not turn back. He had no gift for languages. The classroom was an agony, but while the clever men polished their sermons, he went down into the worst streets of the city, the slums by the harbor, the lodging houses and the jails, and he knocked on doors no one else would knock on. He held meetings in a rescue mission among men the respectable would not touch. He learned to speak to people not by being clever, but by simply not leaving. And slowly, in those terrible streets, the country boy found the one thing the seminary could not teach and could not take away. He found that when he opened his mouth and meant it, people listened. Not because he was eloquent, because he was true. Then, in his second year, a man came to speak at the college who changed the course of his whole life. He was a Canadian too, a missionary home from Formosa, a man with the dust of the far side of the world still on him, and he stood up and told them what it cost and what it was worth. And he said, plainly, that the workers were too few, and the fields too wide, and the time too short. He looked out at those comfortable young men, and he asked them who would go. Jonathan Goforth did not need to be asked twice. He had been waiting his whole life to be asked once. He offered himself to China, and here the story would be tidy if everyone had clapped. They did not. The mission board hesitated. China was dangerous, expensive, far. But Jonathan and a handful of students would not let it rest. They prayed, they petitioned, they raised the money themselves, dollar by dollar, from churches across Ontario, and they would not stop until the board said yes. There was one more thing he needed, though he did not yet know how badly. He needed someone willing to go with him into a life that would ask everything. He found her in Toronto, a young woman, an artist, raised in comfort, gifted, with a future of her own in front of her. Her name was Rosalind. He told her, almost the first time they were alone, that she would have to be willing to let him put God's work before even her, before comfort, before safety, before, if it came to it, their own lives. It was not a romantic speech. It was a warning. She said yes anyway. They were married, and in the early months of 1888 they sailed. He was 29 years old. He had a wife, a calling, and a head full of plans, and he was about to learn that China did not care about any of them. Honan, the province they were sent to, was one of the hardest in the empire. It was inland, proud, closed, suspicious, of foreigners to the point of fury. The missionaries already in China had a grim name for it. The Gibraltar of China, they called it, the fortress that would not fall. The very first time Jonathan and a companion went in to find a place to live, the people drove them out with curses and clods of earth, and they slept in the open, and the message of the whole province seemed to be the same. You are not wanted here. Go home, and then the language. He who had bled over Greek in a warm classroom in Toronto now had to wrestle a tonal tongue with thousands of characters, in the heat, in the dirt, while everything in him was already stretched to breaking. Other men seemed to find it easier. He ground it out the way he ground out everything, by refusing to quit, and, slowly, painfully, the words came. He made a strange decision that the older missionaries thought was madness. The Chinese were terrified of foreigners. Wild rumors flew about what the foreign devils did behind their walls. They steal children, they cut out eyes for medicine. So Jonathan threw his gates wide open. He built his house, when at last he had one, almost like a museum, with rooms a Chinese family could recognize, and he let the crowds come in and walk through it, room by room, gawking, touching, asking, hundreds in a day, thousands in a season. Let them see, he said. Let them see there is nothing to fear. He stood in his own doorway for hours, day after day, year after year, answering the same questions, telling the same story, until the fear began, in that one corner of that closed province, to give way. It was working. The walls were cracking, and then China began to take from him the thing no open door could protect. The graves came one at a time, and each one took a piece of them they never got back. The land-bred fevers the foreign children had no defense against. One of their little ones sickened and died in that far country, half a world from any grandmother, and they buried the small coffin in foreign ground and went back to work because the work would not wait. Then another, and in time another still. They lost more of their children than many people back in Canada would ever know they had had. Rosalind, the gifted artist from a comfortable Toronto home, learned to sew a shroud. Jonathan, the man who would later stand bleeding before a mob without flinching, was found more than once kneeling beside a small fresh mound with his shoulders shaking. Why would God ask this? It is the question the whole story circles, the question that sits unspoken behind every grave. Why would the one who calls a man across the world then let that world take his children one by one? Jonathan never pretended to have a clean answer. What he had instead was a refusal to let go. A man may lose much, he came to believe, and still not lose the one thing. And so, scarred inside in ways the sword would later match on the outside, he kept his hand to the plow. Which brings us back to that courtyard, and the swords, and the blood. In 1900, the Boxer storm broke, and every foreigner in the interior was suddenly a marked target. The order came down to flee for the coast, and the Goforths joined the long, terrible exodus, a wounded line of missionary families fleeing 1,000 kilometers across a country that wanted them dead. It is hard to overstate what that journey was. Days without proper food, nights without sleep. Children burning with fever in the bottoms of carts. And everywhere the same danger waiting at the next town, the next bridge, the next inn, where a crowd might gather and a leader might step forward and decide that today was the day. In one of those courtyards it nearly ended. The mob closed in, a man came at him with a sword, and Jonathan, instead of running, put his own body between the blades and his family. They cut him 5 times about the head. The blood ran into his eyes. At one point he was knocked flat, and a heavy blow came down meant to finish him, and a thick coil of material wound about his helmet turned the edge by a hair's breadth. He should have died. By his own account, he was past fear by then, past pain, in a strange, clear place where he found himself praying not for rescue but for the very men who were trying to kill him. And then, the way these things sometimes turn on nothing, a frightened horse plunged into the crowd and broke it apart. And in the confusion the carts lurched forward, and they were through. He was carried out of Honanan more dead than alive, his scalp in ribbons, his blood soaked through his clothes, and a missionary surgeon down the line stitched what could be stitched, and shook his head over the rest. The marks of that day were on his skull until the day he died. He never minded them. He used to say, mildly, that they were the only diplomas the country boy had ever earned that anyone could see. He could have gone home. They had a wife who had buried children, a body that had been opened by swords, and every reason a man could want to say enough. Canada would have welcomed him as a hero. He would have lived out his days behind a pulpit in a clean Ontario town, telling the story. He went back to China instead. And here, after all the failure and all the grief and all the blood, is where the story turns toward the thing he is remembered for. Because somewhere in those years of loss, Jonathan Goforth came to a conviction that would reorder everything. He had spent himself for 15 years on work, on schedule, on method, on the open house and the long days, and the patient grinding labor. And he had seen real fruit, but he had also seen how little all of it was against the size of the darkness. And he became convinced, reading the old accounts of revivals, of what had fallen on Wales and on other lands in other centuries, that the thing China needed was not a better method. It was not a cleverer man. It was not anything he could manufacture at all. There was one verse he could not get away from. Not by might nor by power, but by my spirit. He took it the way he took everything, all in. If the harvest came at all, it would not come by his strength. His strength had already been proven to the bone. It would come by something else, or it would not come. So he gave himself to prayer the way he had once given himself to the plow. And then he began, almost trembling, to ask for more than he had ever dared to ask. He started to hold special meetings, and he prayed beforehand not for a good attendance but for fire, and it began to fall. In one town, then another, something would come over a meeting that no one could explain, and no one could stop. Men who had sat for years in dead, respectable, lifeless churches would suddenly break. Hardened farmers wept, proud scholars cried out. People who had kept secret sins for a lifetime stood up in the open and confessed them. theft, hatred, cruelty, things no missionary had pried loose in a decade of patient work, poured out now in an hour because something had walked into the room that exposed every hidden thing. The numbers began to climb in a way that frightened even him. A meeting that began with a few hundred would swell to 1,000. He would preach in a single tour to tens of thousands. In the Great Manchurian Awakening, whole congregations were swept up at once, and the movement ran from town to town and province to province, like the grass fire of 1900 run backward, the same wind, the other way. He went into Korea, and the same fire fell. He could scarcely keep up with the doors that opened. The failed seminary student that 2 classmates had mocked on a Toronto streetcar was now the man missionaries from across Asia wrote home about. The man the older societies sent for. The country boy from West Missouri standing before seas of people while the Spirit of God broke them like ground in spring. And what did he say it was? What was his secret? The thing the eloquent men did not have. It was the same answer the deaf and the broken have always given when God uses them past all explanation. He said it was not him. He said plainly that he was a very ordinary man, that any farmer could do what he had done if he were willing to pay what it cost, and that the cost was simply this: not by might, not by power, by the Spirit. He believed God meant the verse literally, and he staked his life on it, and the harvest he reaped is still being counted. You would think such a man would be honored by his own. Some of them despised him. It was not the Chinese who gave him the most trouble in those years. It was, as it so often is, his own side. Respectable churchmen who had never seen a man weep over his sins called the emotion unhealthy. Cautious officials worried about the crowds. Fellow workers muttered that he was an enthusiast, a fanatic, that all this confessing and weeping was excess, that the country boy had never been quite sound. There were committees, and there were whispers, and there were cold letters. A man with thinner skin would have been crushed by it. Jonathan answered the way he had answered the mob. He prayed for the men who attacked him by name, and he did not stop. He had been mocked on a streetcar at 24. He could be mocked in a committee at 50. It did not turn him. He had learned the one freedom that nothing can take from a man who has already buried his children and bled in the dust. He was no longer working for anyone's approval but God's, and so there was nothing left for his critics to threaten. And then slowly, in the last chapter of his life, God asked him for the one thing he had left. His eyes began to fail. For a man whose whole gift was the open road and the open book, going blind was a particular kind of cruelty. He fought it as long as he could. He had operations. He pressed on through fog and shadow. And at last the light went out altogether, and Jonathan Goforth, in his 70s, was a blind man in a country that had cost him almost everything. He did not stop. Let that sink in. The man who could no longer see his own hand in front of his face kept right on preaching. They would lead him to the platform by the arm. Someone would read him the scriptures he could no longer read for himself, and he had so much of the book inside him by then that he hardly needed the help, and he would lift his ruined eyes toward a crowd he could not see, and preach with the same fire that had fallen in Manchuria a quarter-century before. In his last full year in China, blind past 70, he was still traveling, still preaching, still seeing thousands turn. The diplomas on his skull, the darkness in his eyes, the graves of his children scattered across a foreign province. He counted not one of them too high a price. At last, in 1934, old and blind and worn to the bone, he came home to Canada for good, back to the country of the log house and the stony fields, and he went on speaking even then, carried from church to church, telling the story while he still had breath to tell it. On an October night in 1936 in Toronto, the city where 2 students had once laughed at a farm boy on a streetcar, Jonathan Goforth went to bed an ordinary tired old man and did not wake. There was no agony at the end, no last desperate struggle. The man who had been cut 5 times and not fallen, who had buried child after child and not let go, who had gone blind and not stopped, simply closed his eyes one more time and was gone, quietly, in his sleep, into the presence he had spent 50 years pointing other people toward. The funeral was full. They came from everywhere. And across the ocean, in a province that had once driven him out with stones and once tried to take his head, Chinese Christians wept for the foreign devil who had loved them more than his own life. The Gibraltar of China had not fallen to an army or an empire or a clever scheme. It had been taken, in the end, by a stubborn farm boy who could not spell, who prayed for fire and meant it. His scars are dust now. His eyes saw nothing for years before the end. But the churches he prayed into being are still standing in places it is dangerous, even today, to name. The fire he asked for has never quite gone out. If the life of Jonathan Goforth has stirred something in you, then carry the one thing he carried. Comment below with "not by might, but by his Spirit" if you are ready to ask God for more than your own strength has ever been able to give, and tell us whose story you would like us to tell next. And if his courage moved you, don't leave yet, because there is someone you have to meet. Imagine a poor mill girl from the slums of a Scottish factory town, half wild, barely schooled, written off by everyone who knew her, who sailed alone into a stretch of West Africa so deadly that grown men called it the white man's grave. Imagine a woman the chiefs came to fear and the warriors came to obey, who walked unarmed into villages where no man dared go, who snatched abandoned twins from the bush where they had been left to die and raised them as her own until a whole people who had once worshipped the spirits of the forest called her, simply, the mother of us all. How did a girl with nothing become the one person an entire region would not defy? What did she find in her weakness that the strong and the mighty never found in their strength? Subscribe to Heart of Witnesses. Ring the bell, and watch the next story to discover how God took the least likely girl in Scotland and made her a queen in the jungle, and why the very things that disqualify you in the eyes of the world may be the exact things he is waiting to use.